welcome once again to The Stakes, an ongoing monthly podcast hosted by Claremont Senior Fellow and Lecturer and Research Fellow at the Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., Michael Anton. Mike brings on guests to talk about the state of current America and the stakes of our current political and intellectual crisis. His guest this week is our own Matthew Peterson, Vice President of Education here at the Claremont Institute, and, of course, founding editor of The American Mind. They're discussing this recent piece that Mike wrote for the Claremont Review of Books. He's reviewing a book on Texas versus California, and they discuss Matt, a longtime resident of California, although was not born here, but Matt has just moved his family to Dallas, and Matt is very involved in the political and intellectual scene and conservative scene around media and tech and politics in Dallas. It's part of the reason he moved there, working on some side projects. So Matt has a unique perspective. Matt also worked for a long time on sort of local government in California, among other things on local government corruption in California. Mike Anton, of course, was born and raised in California in the Bay Area. And so it's a nice opportunity for both those men to talk about both their experience, but also Mike's argument and the future of Texas and California. So enjoy.
Well, thank you, Ryan. So my latest CRB review, I try to do something for the magazine in every issue, and oftentimes I don't make it because I get busy or this or that, but I did this time. And this was one of the ones, sometimes you get to pick your own idea, and sometimes you get them assigned by editors, and good writers, play along. That is to say, you got to give a little to get a little. So sometimes I want to do some crazy thing, and I'm much more likely to get away with it if when the editor comes at me and says, hey, will you do this? If I gamely say yes. So Charles Kessler asked me to review a book called Texas versus California, I think for a couple of reasons. One is that the authors are actually a colleague of Charles's, who's, of course, everyone knows, the editor of the CRB. A colleague of his at Claremont McKenna College, and I've never met him, but people who know him say he's a decent guy. So people like to get their books reviewed. Second is I've written a lot about California over the years, and much of it in the CRB. So they thought, well, you're an ideal person maybe to review this book. And the thesis of the book is essentially, I should say, here it is. I have it here: Texas versus California by Kenneth P. Miller, professor of political science at Claremont McKenna College. So the thesis of the book is that Texas and California, they have a lot in common structurally, geographically, population-wise, economically, going back decades, a century and a half, more or less. Texas is getting there, right? Founded as a republic in 1836, so it's not quite 2 centuries yet. California, of course, becomes the 50th state, declares itself in 1849, and is admitted to the Union in 1850. Anyway, he says there's all these underlying similarities, and they actually were fairly similar right up to about 30, 40 years ago, where both states went in a very different direction policy-wise. Yeah, 40 is probably too long. I'd say California into the 90s, when Pete Wilson is the Republican governor, is still a more or less pink, not to say communist, but pink as in, not dark blue, but not dark red. It's always a fairly soft Republican state when it was a Republican state, but really started to change in the late 90s and through the 2000s. And now they've just gone in diametrically opposite directions, politically and policy-wise. And so Miller compares the two different approaches and compares and contrasts who's doing what across a whole range of issues. And then at the end, he kind of gives a summary of the relative strengths and weaknesses of each approach. So as I'm writing the review, I'm thinking, this would be a good one. Maybe I'll do a podcast on this. And I said, I got the perfect guy, right? In fact, this guy should have maybe written the review himself instead of me, because I got Matt Peterson. Now, why is he perfect for this? Because he literally lived in California 6 months ago, and now he lives in Texas. And he left California for Texas for exactly the reasons Kenneth P. Miller describes in this book. He said, I'm looking at the 2 state models. One of them works for me and my family, and presumably for a lot of other reasons. One of them really doesn't. I'm going to get the hell out of the one that doesn't work. So I thought, that's ideal. Now, so we're going to talk to Matt today. Now, before that, though, I got to say one thing. This is an academic book, so I don't mean to disparage it. It's a fine book, but it's an academic book. In other words, it's not the most exciting thing, And my review, I thought, was pretty just fair. I explained what the book said. I leveled some criticisms. I made some praiseworthy comments about it, like most book reviews are. This would be the last thing that I thought was going to blow up into anything. And of course, the Claremont and my many enemies seized on the ending, which they deliberately, willfully misinterpreted and distorted to say that I somehow called for civil war and that I'm a terrible person. When in fact, if you read it with ordinary, as to borrow a Straussian term here, if you read it with only ordinary care, you will see that I am warning about such a conflict, that I'm saying California and blue America generally have become incredibly pushy nanny state types that want to impose their will throughout the land. And California wants to rule Texas. Texas doesn't want to rule California, and Texas doesn't want to be ruled by California. And if California and blue America generally keep and I think this insight applies to more than just California versus Texas. It applies really to the whole country. If essentially the blue coastal ruling class keeps insisting that it's their way or the highway on every issue in every corner of this country, they may precipitate a conflict. And the fact that I am noticing that and warning about it is in no way tantamount to me calling for it. It is in fact the opposite. I'm saying cool it, back down, learn to make some compromises, learn to live with your fellow citizens with whom you disagree, and stop being bullies. But of course, the willful misunderstanding ensued anyway. There's no way it was an actual misunderstanding. This is just people lying, distorting what we said so that they can attack us. So I wanted to get that out of the way up front, because it's the one reason why the piece has become notable. Nobody said anything about my actual analysis of the two approaches or my thoughts on the book. So that said, we got the perfect guy for this. We got a former Californian who is now a Texan to tell us all about it. So when we start there, tell us why you left.
Well, I mean, because I wanted to foment civil war, just like you. Yeah, that's what we're all doing here. I just I have to say, I've seen a lot of these attacks right against us in the last few months, and that was one of the dumbest I've ever seen.
Yeah,
ridiculing the review, but so in our case, look, I have 4 kids, and we survived the last year barely being in California. My entire time of coming to college, being there for most of 25 years, and loving the place, falling in love in a way with California too late, as it was starting to decline. For me, the last year was the wake-up call where, number one, it was clear the state was not going to necessarily protect people it regarded as its enemies. I mean, when you looked around, it seemed like law and order is bent in one direction in California, as it is in many other blue coastal areas.
Yeah.
And, frankly, just as someone with a family, I felt as if it was imprudent to stay there.
Yeah. Let me interject here. I mean, we do have they, because I don't live there. I am a native Californian, and I think most people listening to this probably know that, but I haven't lived there since I left for the East in, 1997. Arguably the two worst DAs, I think it's almost inarguable. I guess Larry Krasner in Philly would give him a run for the money, but are in California. Los Angeles County, the nation's largest county by population. Last I looked, 10 million people are in that one county alone. That's where you were, Pasadena. So that's LA County. Even if the Pasadena cops are any good, I don't really know if they are or if they aren't. If anybody gets, arrested in LA County, the fact is the DA is not going to want to prosecute him. And we see some of the tensions arising now where the sheriff of the county, who doesn't patrol individual incorporated towns, but patrols the unincorporated towns, is a fairly anti-crime guy, and he's getting hacked off at this DA. And then you have Chiza Bowden, literally the son of 2 domestic terrorists, 2 literal domestic terrorists, and then the adopted son of 2 others, who's the DA of San Francisco County. And it's just plummeting further into almost complete darkness. So anyway, I just thought I'd
absolutely
throw that out there for the listeners.
And a lot of people know
this is not an irrational fear on your part, right? It's not.
Yes, and a lot of people know about San Francisco and what's happened there with, as you mentioned in your article, and people are talking about. I mean, whole department store chains are just pulling out. People are incensed, they're upset, and in the state of the city officials are telling them, if you don't like it, you should leave. And it's racist to want, law and order. This is absurd, and it's really degenerating very, very quickly. And I think in the last year, what was interesting was, Los Angeles was always a little bit better when it came to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Especially if you lived in a place like Pasadena. But Gascon gets in there, and there's a recall effort against him.
Yeah.
What he's done is just shameful, terrible. I know lots of people who are close to that situation. It's just it's just awful. But so that's number one. Like there's just that this place is disintegrating. And then, of course, you throw in the COVID regulations.
Yeah.
You have kids, they're going to have to wear masks. There's this whole rigmarole where the private schools can do 2 days a week if they have a summer camp or a day camp. And that's the only way they can get together and actually have school. And, once it became clear that the virus simply wasn't what many of us feared it was early on, right? The irony is people who were paying attention were afraid before really the Borg or the mainstream.
Yeah, that was an instance where I initially gave, for what I'm tending to call, I think we all are, just the regime, meaning a kind of word that captures the government, the institutions, the media. They're the regime, right? I gave them the benefit of the doubt on COVID, let's say in February, March, because who knew, right? I mean, these 100-year pandemics, they do happen. They do kill a lot of people. This could have really been one of them. Absolutely. And I went through a period of about 6 weeks where I was kind of like, yeah, maybe, maybe we got to be really careful. Maybe this is all reasonable and we'll see. And then it just, and the longer it went on and the less and less their predictions came true and the more hysterical they got about all dissent, I wonder if they shot so much of their last bits of credibility with a person like me that I'm wondering, like, it must have had a terrible effect on lots of other people too. And when they try to scare me about something else next time, I mean, they really cried wolf big time over this one. If a wolf shows up tomorrow or next month, I'm going to have a hard time believing them until the thing probably bites me. And that's a problem. I mean, you can say that's my fault, but is it really?
Yeah. And I mean, you have to, and this is something where you could just see the state, right? Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, just leap on, and he's not going to let go. I mean, there's a recall against him because of backlash, primarily, I think, due to the COVID restrictions that he's been pushing. And I don't think he cares. He's still saying we're leading the nation on this stuff. California is leading the nation. So you could see, right away, you had the law and order issue, you had the COVID restrictions, which revealed something even deeper. And I think what they revealed was, the scales fell off the eyes of a lot of people who just, had been living there for a while. In the back of your mind, you thought, well, there's still a battle to be fought here. As California goes, so goes the nation. But I think, those two examples in the last year revealed something that, might be considered controversial, but I think is just an incontrovertible truth. And this is not a place where there's any hope in the near future for anything good happening. And that even if you put in Larry Elder as governor tomorrow, per impossible, it won't happen. Yeah. It's impossible.
Well, if I lived there, I'd vote for him, though.
Yeah. But even if you did that tomorrow, you're not going to solve this problem anytime soon. And at a time in which, the country needs people of goodwill to band together and try to fight and do good, I just saw, there really being no opportunity to do that. You're not maximizing your highest and best use by staying in California when the real battles to be fought are in states like Texas and Florida. And the only institutions that the right still owns, ostensibly, are red states. And so red states are the places where we can potentially make actual progress and draw some lines in the sand and try to save the country. Whereas in California, look, this is Venezuela before the collapse, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, granted, it has lots of money and resources still. It has a fine, corrupt oligarchy that runs the state. But it's not going to go anywhere but bad. And after a while, and I just feel like every American should think about this, after a while, you have to say, why would I want to live in a place where the people who are in charge hate me, hate my family, hate everything we stand for, and by the way, are now literally telling some of the tech people in San Francisco when they complain about crime in the streets run amok, if you don't like it, leave. And I kind of felt like that was the message I was getting from the state. And we had lots of friends and everything else. And I just thought, you know what, though, the problem is these people don't want me here. And there's not a good chance to win or do anything good here. So I'm gone. We're done. And I have to tell you, I get the question all the time, like, oh, well, is the weather bad now, Matt? Ha ha, from our old friends.
I was going to ask this because I know what you're going to say, but go ahead and say it.
And I just have to say, like, yeah, it's hot and it's humid here. That's true. It's the summer in Texas. Do I give two craps about that at this point in my life? No, I could give a damn about what the weather is. We have a country to save, and there are far more important things than, the refinement of the beautiful, by the way, beautiful California weather. And that's the least of my worries right now. And I think the same goes for increasing amounts of other people too.
Yeah. All right. So you use the word disintegrating, and I want to unpack that for the following reason. You and I were just both there. We were in San Diego County, Rancho Bernardo, for the Publius Fellowship, and we went out on San Diego Bay, and we saw the glittering downtown and Point Loma neighborhood. There's a certain type of person, lots of them, who are frequent travelers to the state, or who live in a certain part of the state, and the only thing that they ever see, the only little parts they ever see look great, right? So my parents live in Santa Cruz, and I was up there to see them, bookending that Publius trip. Even Santa Cruz, which has always been kind of a scruffy place, with a lot of hippies and homeless and stuff like that, still looks, I didn't go downtown, but like the parts that I saw still look really good, right? And I can bet you that Carmel has not taken any kind of hit, nor has Palo Alto, nor has Newport Beach, and so on. So somebody who only sees those parts of it will think that phrase disintegrating is ridiculous hyperbole overstatement, and that you're just making stuff up, or you had to see one guy in a tent somewhere and you thought, oh, the homeless are taking over. So what would you say to a person like that?
Yeah, so I think, first off, we have to acknowledge the truth of what they see. This is still a beautiful place with an incredible amount of wealth, one of the largest economies in the world. The question is, when you say disintegrate, goes to form or structure. The question is, how is that economy structured, right? What is the ordering of the parts in California? And that's where you see a kind of disintegration or a kind of grave danger. So we'd first want to acknowledge that, yes, many of these places are still just fine. In fact, I have a friend who sells real estate in Santa Barbara, and he says, he's doing really well. Right? People are moving in from LA and San Francisco and even other states. People are moving from Chicago, right? So if you have wealth and you have money, there are still, of course, plenty of places you can go in California where you'd be just fine. And even in places where the crime is going down, they're just getting private security, especially in the Bay Area. So you're not going to be fine. And I had the same feeling when we were in San Diego for the Publius Fellowship. Look. There's a sense of, when you're on those hills, right, of some kind of blissful ignorance, right, and all you see is beauty, and I think the same thoughts as these people. But here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that if you get in your car, start driving around, you're going to see some signs that this isn't right, even before you really poke into the rotten heart of the thing. So just an example, like physical, visceral example. I took my kids, when I was out there, to a Padres game.
Yeah.
I went with some of the fellows to a Padres game. And I was driving around, and all of a sudden, without even thinking about it, just in downtown San Diego, where I used to live in North County, San Diego for about three or 4 years before I joined the Institute again. And I was just looking around going, what? Wait a minute, there's a guy with a sharpened stick with no shoes on in the middle of the street. And he had a sharpened stick.
Yeah,
and a beard, and no shoes. He looked like some kind of castaway pirate, and he's in the middle of the street. And I'm driving with my kids in the car, going, "What?" And then I started looking around, and you realize, there's crap on the street here in beautiful San Diego,
and that's actually indicative, because unlike San Francisco or LA, San Diego has a real mayor and a real DA who prioritize actually enforcing the law and keeping public order. So if it's even happening there, imagine how bad it is in these places where the official authorities have not merely given up, but they've taken the side of criminals and disorder.
Yes. And so you start to see this fraying around the edges. Even in San Diego, when you walk around downtown, you see evidence of a kind of decline. Now, what's the juxtaposition here, though? It's between the bottom of the streets and the tops of these beautiful buildings, right? You got crap on the street as you park your car, and yet you still have this glittering, monuments to capital in San Diego, which still has lots of money. And so this is this is the problem. I'll give you another example. In Pasadena, where we lived, it wasn't super fancy, but it was nice. It was a very nice area. Certainly, most of the country would consider the cost of housing there and everything is very fancy where we were. And so we left. Since we've left, there have been all kinds of incidents in that neighborhood. in terms of break-ins, in terms of a girl right down the block from where my daughter used to walk when she was 12, 13. Girl about the same age got accosted by someone from behind who basically assaulted her. She got away right where we were living. So you can see, in other words, this actual physical drift all around you, whether you're in Pasadena or wherever you are, as soon as you drive out of that fancy neighborhood. And that is just a sign, right, of a deeper problem, which is actually much more frightening. If you look at the actual structure of the law, right, you look at what the legislature is doing every week, the kinds of laws that they are passing, the kinds of policies that governmental structures are taking, and all of a sudden things get much worse.
Yeah, well, and I would add to that, on the question of disintegration, all you have to do is read a little Victor Davis Hanson about the other California, that is to say the non-glittery coastal spots. The whole rest is a big state. There's a lot of area, there's a lot of land to cover, right? And if all you ever see are little coastal jewels and inland, hot spots like Tahoe or Palm Springs and stuff like that, you'll think it's fabulous. But, Victor says, just scout around on the valley floor and look at what some of those cities look like. And it is awful. I mean, they're literally disintegrating. The roads are literally disintegrating. So 2 years ago, because there was no COVID and LA County was open, we had the Publius Fellowship in Claremont. And I thought, well, I used to drive this all the time. I'll just drive it. Rent a car. I have to rent a car when I get down there anyway. Why not just rent a car here and drive all the way down? It used to take me 6 hours. It took 9.5 that time. That was bad. But the other thing I noticed too is like these major, just as Victor said, these major highway arteries in the Central Valley are crumbling. They're not being maintained or fixed anymore. Right. I didn't, and I did stop and go into one, I call it Haute Californians, and the French word Haute, Santa Maria, because it's right off the 101 on the way down. And it's where my wife went to high school, and I had my daughter with me, and I wanted her to show that. And that town looked really scruffy and bad. And I remember going to Santa Maria, and it was never a paradise, but it was just a functional middle-class place. It looks ragged and run down now in a way that it didn't 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah. And so this is, the physical disintegration of infrastructure, the bizarre problems with water and fire, right? Yeah. The basic elements that have been really misused and mismanaged. And whether you go out to, a Fresno or a Stockton, which is very similar in my mind to the kind of Rust Belt cities, that just, they're hollowed out. There's rampant drug use, addiction. People don't have a lot of options. And if you go north, you'll even find some coastal cities where supposedly, you'd think things would be nice, but they're far enough from really any money where they have this, it's like a burned, bombed out, kind of small towns up in the redwoods where there seems like there's nothing to do for people but to smoke weed and to get unemployment. So you have this growing underclass, never mind, illegal immigration, but you have this growing underclass of people who are just already in the state that increasingly are they're like like indentured servants or something. This is a underclass that is now being normalized, as they say today, and you have a middle class that's basically non-existent or gone, and that's definitely under siege, almost viciously attacked, right? So if you're in the Inland Empire, which is where the Claremont Institute is, San Bernardino County. LA takes in a lot of the stuff we get from China. So it's an enormous port city, and all of that stuff. Fancy people on the west side don't even really like to pretend this isn't even the case. But LA receives all this stuff from China, and then it goes out, and there's a lot of logistics and whatever else to package it all up and send it throughout the rest of the country. Well, there still is a working class based around that, but you wouldn't even know it exists, right? If you drive around a lot of LA, because what you're going to see is either a tent city with medieval diseases on the highway overpass, or you go into the guarded, the walled gardens of these fancy cities. And, that middle class, that used to be really important to Southern California, and it's squeezed out. It's squeezed further and further out away from LA County. And you can physically see, I guess is what I'm saying, and what you're saying, you can physically see the evisceration of a middle class.
So
you look around the state.
One obvious question that someone would ask, so I will ask it is, if it's disintegrating and if it doesn't work and they don't enforce the law and there's crime everywhere and people are leaving, why is it still so expensive?
Well, I mean,
that's a facetious question, but it's also in that I think I have some answers, but I don't think I have the answer. I think I can spitball some ideas, but it is still kind of puzzling. I mean, if price is a measure of demand, which of course it is, then demand must still be high. So, Victor Davis put it this way. He says, if you're the right kind of person, like it's a great place to be for the very wealthy who can insulate themselves from pathologies that are around them, while live in the gated communities, hire the private security, send your kids to private school, or buy into one of those high functioning school districts if you can afford, like Palo Alto or something. And it's a great place to live if you're coming from serious rural poverty in South America, Central America, Southern Mexico. California it's a huge upgrade. It doesn't work for anybody else, but there's still enough people and enough demand from those two sides of the coin that it keeps the prices very, very high.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. Also, I mean, there is a basic point where if if there's not a lot of supply, I mean, they don't really build single family homes.
They don't build. Yeah.
They do everything they can to make sure that single family homes, in fact, can't be built. So really, the only thing that you're building there is either very high end stuff for people who can pay, or you're building stuff for affordable housing for people who have very little income, and that's all that gets built. So I think that there is that's a real problem. I mean, this was years ago. I remember up in Sacramento, it was at least $200,000 per house that a builder had to pay before they built anything.
Yeah,
and that was like middle class residential housing in the Sacramento region. So that's an enormous problem. And you do have a kind of the influence of the weather as a draw, but I don't think that that's actually operating in the calculus right now, because I think what you said is true. Those are the two people it's attracted to. And look, there's been a rise. We should say, I mean, some of our people we like to argue against, like AEI or whatever, these establishment conservative types, they're not wrong that the ranks of the upper middle class and the wealthy, have gotten wealthier.
Yeah.
The wealthy have gotten wealthier and the ranks of the upper middle class have grown. The problem is the ranks of the middle class have shrunk, and more people have gone to the other side of that equation in these states as well. So it's certainly true that there's plenty of money in the country, to throw around.
I mean, I wonder if, I said it in the review that the state's going to lose a congressional seat for the first time since becoming a state in 1850. So 170 years, so the population's going down. That should mean prices will drop, but maybe marginally. We'll see if that actually comes true, though. You brought up the weather more than once. It's interesting that, I don't want to make fun of Miller. I mean, the book is it's decent for an academic book. It is an academic book, which means it's a bit dry, but it has good information. Most academic books are just complete garbage and they don't tell you anything. This book is not that. It does tell you things that you didn't know. Even I didn't know, and I think I know California pretty well. I certainly don't know Texas that well, so I learned much more about Texas than I learned about California from reading it. But he talks about the weather a lot. And I couldn't help but sort of chuckle to myself. It's like your case so the book tries to sort of be even-handed and say, well, they both have strengths and they both have weaknesses. And he doesn't quite say this, but his implication seems to want to be to say, and they sort of net out in the end. Neither one's really better. And I go, okay, well, let's compare the two cases. His case for California he hangs a whole lot on the weather, which is not negligible, but when you're putting that much on the weather and on Yosemite Valley and on the beaches and all these things are fabulous, you're doing that because you don't have a whole lot else to say about the human side of the equation, the institutions, the society, the economy, and so on. And then when you get to the end, he criticizes, and he's much more frank, I think, in his criticism of California. It's the progressivism, the strangling regulation, the high taxes, the high cost, and so on. When he tries to grope for, that's my term, a reason to criticize Texas, the one that he comes up with, I didn't think was all that convincing. I mean, he tries to put it in the mouth of Texas business leaders who say, well, our state doesn't spend enough on education, and therefore we're not going to have the high-end workforce that we're going to need to be a powerhouse economy. And I thought, maybe. But, one thing that's pretty fundamental, and you do a little research into, just read the summaries, the abstracts of research into education, and you'll learn within 5 or 10 minutes that spending doesn't correlate with student achievement, that some of the highest spending school districts in the country have some of the worst outcomes. So I wonder if that's a real thing, or was he just looking for something that he knew he had to say something critical? You haven't maybe been there long enough, but have you ever heard, is this a thing? And does the Texas business community go around saying we need to up our per capita school spending to compete?
Well, it certainly is something that people who are inclined, to be moderate or to the left, I have heard say.
Yeah.
So it is something they'll say, but of course, it's completely fallacious. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous to me. I mean, California is at the bottom of, almost.
It's not quite at the bottom. I think it's depending on the metrics, though, but it's in the bottom. It's in around 37, 38, depending on what you're exactly looking at. There are it's definitely in the bottom half and in the bottom third, but not at rock bottom. And it wasn't that long ago in my lifetime where it was either first or close to first in terms of the quality of the public schools and the outcomes.
Right, and I think that is the decline is rapid. We just had an article on the end of merit by Joel Kotkin, and he talks a little bit about this and uses California as an example of the problem that's occurring in education. And it's almost every day you read a headline where San Diego school district gets rid of grades, grading students based on disciplinary problems or absences, right? So I mean the standards continue to decline, and they've declined rapidly in California. So I think it'd be hard to make that case with a straight face now, whereas probably 10, 15 years ago, I mean, it's kind of an old one, right? People in Texas will go, well, we should be more enlightened like California and spend more money on schools. But here's the case also for, I think, red states in general, and it was a big part of our move. You don't have any room to experiment in California, right? I mean, it's going in one direction. So it's not just that, okay, it has the weather, but, there's this decline, or, I mean, the momentum here is the same as the momentum of the population in the last 20, 30 years. So it was after 2010 was the first time California didn't gain, first time in its history didn't gain a seat in Congress. This year, it's actually losing one. And so when we talk about people moving around the country this year, what's happening is merely an acceleration of trends that have been going on for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
It's not new, right? That Californians are moving to Texas. And so this is it is accelerating, and the trends are certainly becoming clearer. But the problem is when you have that kind of momentum in the other direction, you have no room to experiment. So to me, it would be much more likely that Texas could experiment with its public education system to find ways to train people for jobs that are actually going to be needed, right? Whereas in California, I mean, you're not even counting the SAT anymore to go to the UC school. Yeah. So, this seems to me like a very cut and dry case.
Yeah. So you mentioned Californians moving to Texas, and I'll tie this to another thought, or question. A lot of people, when, what was it, 2018, when Beto O'Rourke, it seemed plausible that, this is the rock solid Republican state, the cornerstone of the Republican electoral coalition, might elect a liberal Democrat as a senator. Now they didn't, but a lot of people have been saying for a long time, Texas is inevitable. Sooner or later, it's going to go blue, and it'll go blue for two reasons. One, because it has the longest border with Mexico, and so it gets tons and tons and tons of legal and illegal immigration. And second, because of in-migration of people when they, I called them in an article I wrote for American Conservative, blue locusts. They sort of strip mine and destroy some liberal paradise, and they go, oh, I got to get out of here now. And then they go and they bring their view, so the Californians leave, and then they turn Oregon and Washington and Nevada and Arizona blue, although Oregon and Washington, certainly Nevada and Arizona are still kind of purple. There's a lot of people, as you well know, because you were the one telling me about this when you did you were in a car on a long road trip, and you said like the people in Idaho were really cranky. They didn't like to see California plates. Like, stay out of here. Don't come and Californicate us. Is Texas, do you think, being Californicated by these people moving? So I've heard this two ways. I heard people go, yeah, absolutely, it's happening. You should worry about it. And then I hear other people say, it's not really happening. In fact, because right now most of the movement is from red types or independents who want to get out of the liberal paradise, and to some extent they're making these states redder. And one example I would give is Florida, whose share of the vote for Trump actually went up from 16. It wasn't even a close race in 2020. And the way it was a nail, but Trump won it by a thin margin in 2016, won it by like 3.5, 4 points 2020, and a lot of that is attributed to people leaving New York and leaving other blue states and going to Florida. So what do you think is happening in Texas on that regard?
It's funny because this is a very emotional issue for a lot of people for good reason. As I thought when I was driving around the country this summer, I wouldn't want to go anywhere that would naturally want to have me as a Californian.
Yeah.
I'd only want to go somewhere where they saw the plates and said, please get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
But so obviously, don't California my Texas is the line. I think that sadly, we actually need a lot more research, and probably it's not even more research. We need the right people doing the surveys and studies and looking at the data from the last year as it starts to come out. I think it's unclear right now which way it goes. I think that there certainly is evidence that in a moderate way, but even a moderate shift here is significant. In a moderate way, of late, this domestic migration has actually assisted the reddening of both Texas and Florida.
Yeah.
And so it's not as if everyone who moves here is helping keep Texas Texas, but it surely is the case that it's been exaggerated that, because why? Because Texas has gotten redder. I mean, in the last election, the Democrats really got wiped here.
Yeah.
I mean, the only place they really did decent is in DFW, where I am, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But even there, I mean,
tell us a little if you remember the story. I don't know all the details, but there was a wipeout at a local election over CRT somewhere, right? And it was a fairly Democratic area, yes. and even maybe majority Hispanic. I don't remember that. And basically, it was a one-issue election about, are we going to do CRT in the schools? And the candidates who said hell no swept out all of the candidates who said yes. Yeah.
So there's a couple. I mean, so there's McAllen, Texas, heavily Latino, first Republican mayor, I think ever in that city. In Southlake, which is a suburban area, not too far from where I live. There was an entire election based on critical race theory, and it's utter and complete rejection. You have a legislature that is increasingly taking much bolder moves than it has in the past for the state that kind of Bushes and establishment Republicans are in. You have Abbott, who a lot of us don't fully trust on these things, but who is certainly taking bold moves and should be applauded for them. Almost on a daily basis, he's getting more radical and taking good steps in the right direction, at least for someone from his kind of area of the Republican Party. Then you got a lieutenant governor who just squashed a bunch of woke garbage about the Alamo and Dan Patrick. So you see these signs of life. You see the momentum is moving in the other direction, and as you say in your review, right, these are different places and they do stand out. And it's not as if Texas, and we could add Florida and some other red states to that list, they're not becoming purple. They're moving in the other direction, and it's very pronounced, and you can actually see it. Now, that being said, I do want to offer a qualifier. I think there's something to the blue locust problem, right, of people spreading around and moving states to the other side. But what I would say is the shifts here don't have to be big, right? They can to have a significant impact. We're talking about a 4 or 5% election being pretty demonstrative in these states, right? So,
since you mentioned the Alamo, that reminds me, that was another thing that I got savaged for my piece. So one of the things that I noticed a long time ago I haven't spent a ton of time in Texas. I think my first trip there, I was 10, but I've been there a few times. I've known some Texans. They both, I said this in the review, both states have really interesting histories, but California kids don't really know it. Now, like I can remember going on a field trip to Sutter's Fort, going up to the Gold Country. There was some feeble attempt to teach us, but it's really, as I understand it, it's really well institutionalized in the Texas public schools that you will learn the history of Texas, how it was settled, how it became an independent republic, how it joined the United States. You will learn all this stuff. You will learn who Sam Houston was, Davy Crockett, and you will learn about the Alamo. Right. And so I thought that, and that's one of the reasons why you and I have talked about this, and we've talked about it with Dave Reboy and others, right? There's a kind of state level patriotism in Texas, in addition to the national USA patriotism among Texans that doesn't exist in California and doesn't really exist in most states that I know of. And so I just mentioned this. I said, look, this is the strength that Texas has that will enable it or inspire these people to preserve what they think of as their Texas way of life. I said, the spirit of the Alamo still burns remember the Alamo has been a phrase that goes back, to the Alamo. People say that. And I was absolutely ridiculed for this. It's like, that was a defeat, you moron. I mean, what? I mean, even Straussians who don't remember, I suppose, that famous passage in Natural Right and History where he talks about the nobility of last ditch resistance as an example to future generations. You should, first of all, if I'm wrong about applying that insight to the Alamo, you should tell that to the Texans, because I didn't make it up. I got it from them. But anyway, I wanted to respond to that because I thought it was just an incredibly stupid kind of bad faith thing to pick apart. But I do believe that if Texas is not going to be changed from the outside, either by domestic in-migration or by federal mandates and things like this, it's going to be because Texans say, that's not who we, to borrow a phrase from Barack Obama, they're going to say, that's not who we are. And they're going to say that because they have a sense of who they are. They know who they are. And they're willing to fight for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that's really struck me since actually moving and physically being here is that these little things matter a lot. And so what do I mean by little things? Well, what you describe, you can see in these little examples. So we come across the border. We actually drove. I mean, all our stuff was shipped out here, and we drove with the kids from California, and we get to Amarillo and wake up in the morning, and there's a Texas-shaped, waffle iron in the hotel. And it's a joke. The rest of the country kind of knows, or anyone who comes here knows. The Texas Star is everywhere. Yeah. The Texas is everywhere. The
big kind of stereotypical thing in the 80s, when I remember it was like guys from Texas, in addition to the cowboy hat and the boots, which was very common back then, is the Texas shaped belt buckle. You have your ranch jeans and your Texas, your brass Texas belt buckle.
No, I mean, you're representing. And so all but here's what's so important about that is having a sense of pride and identity in the political structure you live in. Then you can tie history to it, right? And I think the difference, couldn't be more stark. California has a fascinating history that you and I both love. I mean, find it very interesting, and it's very Western, and it has incredible, it's part of the story of America in just this integral way.
But people don't, you will not come out of a California public school with any idea who John C. Fremont was. Yes. Whereas you will, as I understand it, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, you will not get out of a Texas public school without knowing who Sam Houston was, without knowing who these great heroes that founded the Republic of Texas were. You will know. They will teach you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to be done here in the schools, and the state shouldn't be complacent about it. But by way of comparison, that is clearly the case. And to me, that's why there's an enormous difference between the states and the way in which people conceive of politics. Now, I do think that's weakening here. It's been weakening for a while. There are certainly many forces within the state who would like to destroy the kind of thing you're talking about. And California, the Texas education system, to some extent, that process has already begun. But the thing is, there's a real resistance to that here among people, even instinctively on both sides of the aisle, among regular people, because of that state identity. And this goes to the heart of what they're trying to erase nationally. I mean, when you really see this in action, you see how important it is to the way in which people conceive of their political life, right? I mean, because they have that history, the way in which they make choices, the way in which they evaluate and assess what's going on is very different. Whereas if you can erase the past, you make people more dependent upon overlords in the present. And I think that's what you see in California when we said, when you picked up on disintegration, right? Why is it disintegrating? Why is the social fabric disintegrating? Because if you don't have that history, and in fact, the history is about how, whatever whiteness is evil, and we need to avenge the wrongs of the past, then you make yourself dependent upon powerful forces in the present. Whereas if you have a rootedness or a history, you have a way of looking at politics and unifying with other people that doesn't require these elite overlords telling you what to do all the time.
So I want to step back for a second and kind of, we were talking about, those recent local elections that went well for Republicans, for opponents of CRT and stuff, including one in a majority Latino town. We also saw in 2020, something a lot of people have been predicting for a long time. I think some people have been predicting it out of hope, and some people have been predicting it as kind of a screen for other things. But whatever, it happened, right? There's a pretty big shift of Hispanics toward Trump. Now, not a majority, not a national majority. I don't even think any of a majority in Texas, but where it was most pronounced was in the Rio Grande Valley, which, as I understand it, and you can learn a little from this book too, like of the Hispanic communities in the USA, that one, the one in New Mexico, which literally been there since colonial times in the 17th century, and the Californios, the descendants of Spaniards and then later Mexican rule, who essentially the United States inherits when it takes over California in 1849. These are the oldest Latino communities in the country. And do you think this is, was that a one-off because Trump was popular, because 2020 was a weird year, or do you think something's happening there? There's a shift that maybe portends a realignment?
I mean, look, so first, let's just qualify this with, how many cuck Republicans have said there's going to be a realignment, right? Mm-hmm. In our lifetimes.
Usually when they used to say it, they would say, you need to support more immigration because Hispanics are naturally with Republicans. Right. And if you don't have, you'll never win again. But meanwhile, they knew full well that it was billionaires saying this because immigration is good for our business. And it was Democrats saying this because they know that, in fact, the opposite had been true up to that point. That is to say, as I put it in my book, if you want the single highest correlation for whether a district votes Democrat is percentage of foreign born. Nothing correlates more tightly. So they know that now, but some things are trends until they aren't. And maybe something's changing. I don't know. That's why I asked.
Yeah, I do think so. I do think something has changed and flipped. And of course, the irony is that Trump is the one who did it. And Trump has flipped the switch among a certain part of the Hispanic community. And if the Republicans don't continue to move in that direction, they will lose this. But look, these were Democratic counties. This was, these areas were predictably Democrat, and they're not anymore. And you see signs that it wasn't just one election. You see local elections since, the presidential election, where things are moving in this direction. So I think there's lots of evidence, actually, that this is a shift. But what's going to be necessary is that Republicans actually learn from Trump, stay very hard on immigration. And I worry about them not doing that. But if they do, if they stay tough on immigration, and they continue to move they continue to walk through the door that Trump opened, I don't think this is going away at all. I think people are increasingly, done. This segment of the Latino population is ready to turn the page, and you could see it in many ways. First off, you had a lot of people working in energy, and Joe Biden basically said you're all going to lose your job. He hasn't stopped with that noise, and it's becoming very clear. The differences between what Trump proposed and what Biden's doing are stark. So the main thing is for Republicans not to, do their usual pandering thing and act like the left to people who are, quote unquote minorities. They just need to push forward on the same policies, and I think that there's a lot of reason for hope.
do you get, I guess, one sees online? So, for instance, when states, when the redder states started to say, "I'm not doing we're lifting the mask mandates or we're ending the lockdown," there was a lot of liberal shrieking, saying like, "Oh my God, I was just about to move to Texas and now I can't because they won't force masks and stuff." And then they'd get tweeted at, like, "Good, stay out. We don't want people like you." Do you get any sense though? I've only been there 6 months, but that libs are leaving, like they're saying, "I guess this is getting too red, Christian, conservative, crazy for me. I got to go to Massachusetts or Minnesota. I got to get out of here."
I mean, my gut says there may be a little bit of that happening, but I don't think it's enough of a trend yet. So I think, put it this way. I think there's a lot of people who are starting to think that way.
Yeah.
They're starting to say out loud, like on Twitter, like, I might have to leave here if this continues, right? And the same, by the way, is going on in California. There's a lot of people who, if this recall doesn't work out, right, are actually going to say, okay, I'm going to join the rest of my friends and get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a kind of self-reinforcing mechanism going on. Like, again, the trends there's a lot of momentum. There's 20 years of momentum behind these trends. So, but I don't think there's a mass lib exodus from Texas yet, sadly. However, I do think it's becoming harder. Certainly this is the case, especially with the COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
It's becoming a lot harder if you are on the lib side to justify moving here.
Yeah. So you and your family felt welcome? Have you experienced any blowback? Like, "Hey, California, don't come here and F us up"? Because I noticed one thing, and this is just Twitter, so online, who knows, it's all crap. But when my article came out, and everybody, not everybody, but a handful of people tried to accuse me of fomenting civil war, there was a little sort of bot meme where Texans, or people claiming to be Texans, were like saying, you don't know nothing about Texas. Like, you're not a Texan. I was like, okay, well, I didn't claim to be a Texan. I just reviewed a book that was partly bad. But right. I wonder, like, is there any kind of, hostility from locals and long-termers there who, all these basically internal migrant foreigners are invading our state and changing its character?
Yeah,
I'll give you one example. So I live in Northern Virginia. It is a completely blue paradise of federal bureaucrats, lobbyists, intel execs, that is today intelligence agency executives, law partners, and so on. 20 years ago, when I first moved to Washington, there was still enough, certainly like when I first came in, let's say the early 90s, there was still enough of that old time sense of Virginia that long-timers complained about the colonization of, as they called it, of Northern Virginia, and they called it occupied Virginia. Right, meaning like these civil wars, and so, "Oh, you live in Arlington or Alexandria or whatever. That's occupied Virginia. That's not the real Virginia." Like that, I haven't heard that in 2 decades. Like, because right. Everybody just accepts this is what it is. The place has been changed. But I wonder if is there any, because Texas has not yet really been changed. I wonder, is there any sense of like, you people are coming and changing our state, and we don't like you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's
even if you're on the, if you're Republican and you're coming there and you're conservative and you're coming to the state because you like it and you want to live there and you agree with what they're doing, even, is there hostility even if that's understood?
I think there's 2 types of people where I see that. I mean, at the more genteel folks will say, "Oh gosh, well then you're welcome." Yeah. And the people who actually I like best, who are not as genteel, are kind of still staring at you like, "Well, I'll believe it when I see it," Yeah. And I respect that. I think there's a kind of, and you see it on Twitter exactly, there's a kind of defensiveness that I think is healthy. And it's, look, you don't know the state. We don't really want, outsiders here. We don't want to change things. Now, on the other hand, I think that a lot of the migrants like myself are here to help change things, keep things from changing. And so I think there's some people who are actually, who do realize that and are welcoming to it. So let me put it this way. I've always liked, the way I always put it was like, I love Texans. I'm not sure about Texas, because I was thinking like, well, the weather's there is pretty bad, I hear, and I don't really know that much about it. But I always enjoyed what I kind of could discern as a notably Texan kind of traits and qualities. Anyway,
I mean, one
here,
thing I suppose not to do is you don't move there from California and immediately start wearing the belt buckle and the cowboy boots, the jeans and the hat, and going howdy and saying y'all. And that's
yes,
that probably will not endear you to the local population.
That's right. That's right. Except I do wear the boots because I used to wear boots in Michigan and I love boots.
Okay.
And I'm looking for the excuse to do it. So I have no problem wearing the boots. That's just a fashion statement and they're comfy. But yeah, you don't want to pretend. I think the important thing is not to pretend you know more than you do, right? Yeah. But here's the thing. I think people are very, they're very interested in any idea to help the state. And they realize that they need to focus on and can't be as complacent about their state. So in that respect, I think it's very welcoming. So, for someone like me, it's being like being a kid in a candy shop because I get to learn a lot about the lay of the land. And then if I have, ideas or something to share or whatever, people are very open actually at an elite level. They are very welcoming and they want to bring in talent to help revive their state, to keep it, to keep it true to itself and to make it better. And so, that's why I feel like there's so much that can be done here because people actually are much more receptive once they realize who you are and what you're about.
That's one of the theses of the book, the Miller book. And it used to be a lot more common. I'm actually kind of surprised I'm not seeing more of this today, but it used to be a lot more common where states would rather explicitly compete with other states for business and say, move your firm here. And, these are all the benefits, this is the tax break and this is the permitting we can do for your new facility and stuff like that. Is Texas doing that right now, either to California or to other blue states, just sort of explicitly saying, come here, it's free. It's not free as in cost free, but like free as in there's liberty, there's real liberty here. And the state is not hostile to business. We want you to succeed. So if you're strangled by taxation and red tape, well, get the hell out. I don't see that explicitly, but maybe I'm missing it.
So I might be missing it as well, and I've only been here since the beginning of the year. My sense of it is that that was a thing as Miller documents, but Texas has moved away from kind of officially doing that, at least to the extent it used to, because it is easy to forget, right? There were advertisements, and I mean this was actually like PR, right? Official PR. I think that my own opinion is that we should get back to doing that in red states and make this a little bit more explicit, right? About why people are moving, because you can't. Here's the problem. The problem is and I get it, right? You want to sit around and say, look, we don't want these damn Californians coming in. We don't want these blue locusts coming in. Get the hell out. Well, here's the thing. You can't put up a wall, right? As much as I want to. Between Texas and New Mexico, to keep the Californians out. So what are you going to have to do? Well, you're going to have to signal in some way what you want and what you don't, and what your state is about and what it should not be about. And so I think that people need to realize this migration has been going on for, again, 20 plus years. Austin is going to keep growing. DFW is going to keep growing. They're not going to stop coming. So we got to be realistic about what do we do with this growth and how do we make it the kind of growth that we want and that can actually be healthy, as opposed to the kind of growth that is going to destroy everything good about Texas and about the other red states too. So we've talked about this. Dave Reboy is a great guy for this issue online as well. But I think there's all kinds of things that these states can do to actually, have a determinate plan for how they are going to manage the growth and signal to people what they want and what they don't want in terms of people moving into their state. They should feel nothing wrong about that.
Yeah. I mean, I said half as a joke and half seriously in the Blue Locusts article that I did for American Conservative, that some red state billionaire should just spend a lot of money buying billboards with one giant word just says Jesus in big block letters. That scares your average coastal blue clerical overclass worker more than garlic scares a vampire. You mentioned there's a couple of things I want to ask about. One is, you mentioned Florida. In a sense, so Texas versus California, I think Miller's right. Those are the two poles of blue and red America. But there's also a kind of an interesting red versus red dynamic in Texas versus Florida, because Texas and Florida are the two biggest, richest, most culturally influential red states. Texas, obviously, significantly larger population, a lot more business, but Florida's no slouch, right? And this is still, I think, around 20 million. And they seem to have been doing the best in terms of attracting people who, talent, for lack of, everybody knows somebody who went to Florida in the past year, and everybody knows at least one person or family that went to Texas in the last year. In fact, some people debate it. Well, gosh, I know I got to get out of where I am, and I'm either going to Texas or to Florida, and they make pro and con lists and things like that. I don't know if you have any insights into that. Into that rival. I mean, it's a friendly rivalry in that they're both kind of trying to do similar things for similar reasons, but obviously, different states, different populations, different governing models.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because when you really look at the red versus blue, it's New York. It's very clearly New York and Florida. New York and California versus Florida and Texas. And so let's talk a little bit about the differences and similarities. I think first off, it is a friendly rivalry, although it works in a kind of funny way. Look, Ron DeSantis is the front runner outside of Trump. Yeah. You take Trump off the table, the very clear front runner for 2024 for the entire Republican Party in the country. Things could change, but he is incredibly popular because of what he has actually done. He seems to have internalized some of the lessons that Trump taught the Republican Party, and really, is not just imitating; he's doing the real thing.
And as the kids would say, he's significantly more based than Abbott.
Yes.
Abbott's much more conventional, old time. Country club is probably too dismissive, but let's say Chamber of Commerce Republican.
Yeah, and I think Abbott, Abbott, to his credit, I'll give him credit for it, has tried to take a lot of steps to to either obscure if you're against him, or or evolve if you're more friendly, and to show that he's not simply a country club Republican. And I have to give credit to the governor for that. But clearly, the perception among even the base in Texas is, look, Abbott's good. A lot of them, they like him, but they see DeSantis as someone who is kind of leading right now. So in terms of political leadership, you'd have to say, that what Florida has is Ron DeSantis. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the health of the parties, I think that the Texas Republican Party is in very, very, very good shape overall, even though it does have some significant challenges when it comes to the blueberries, the big blue areas. Austin, Houston, and DFW. But the party is in very good shape. Redistricting is only going to help it. And it's taken some really bold actions in the last few years. And so, there's a lot of inner fighting and so forth. But the fighting politically here is between, basically your not even country club, more just like you said, Chamber of Commerce Republicans versus red meat kind of MAGA. And a lot of times those two things are mixed up here in strange ways. So I think the health of the Republican Party is very strong. In some ways, it might be stronger than it is in Florida. And then talk about the economy. Now, weather-wise, Florida is kind of more interesting in a way to most people, at least the perception of the state. There's truth to that. The ocean there is beautiful. Florida has a kind of exotic place in some ways. Miami's getting a lot of press because of the tech, right, moving there. Yeah. And that's certainly, it's not just.
I've only been to Florida a few times into the obvious places, but as I understand it, it's kind of three states. The northernmost tier is basically just the American South, right? Yes. It's Alabama, it's Georgia. It's very similar to Alabama and Georgia and so on. The middle is what we might more think of as a kind of, centered around Orlando, is more California-like, or the old California-like, sort of middle class and more, I don't know, ordinary, maybe just sort of more middle American. And then the southern part is the really exotic part, a lot of Latin Americans. In fact, look, I used to work for several corporations, and every single one of them had their head of Latin American operations headquarters in Miami, not in a Latin American city, because Miami functionally is a Latin American city because there's so many Latin American people there and so much Spanish is spoken, and it is the business hub of the whole Latin American region. So, and also, it's where you get your super elite level type peoples in places like Palm Beach. So it's kind of, I don't know enough about Texas to say if it's 2 states or 3 states or what, but it's big. So there's a lot, reminds me of that line in My Early Life by Churchill when he gets on the train in India for the first time as a young subaltern to take a trip. And it's like its trip took like 14. I was expecting, like going from London to Edinburgh, but it took like 18 hours. India is a big place.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. I mean, there's some ideas I have about that, but I'm very cautious in laying them out because, look, I've only been here for a little while, and I'll let other people speak to that. But I'll put it this way: I think that there's a significant difference in size, and that work, the kind of size we're talking about, works in a variety of ways. So, when you're talking about just population and sort of resources and power, I mean, I don't think there's really any comparison because DFW is the largest red state metroplex. Houston is the largest red state city. These are very big places with a lot of capital, a lot of a lot of different kinds of business, a lot of finance. I haven't even mentioned Austin, right, as well, which is, there's a lot of tech there. That's for real. I mean, we're sending, just like Florida has this as well, but we're sending rocket ships up more and more. You have people like Musk here. You have Oracle moving here, which probably is more of a blue locust, but let that be. And there's lots of there's just lots of anchored sectors.
I don't know about that. I mean, I probably a lot of the employees are, but as what I know of Larry Ellison and some of the rest of the leadership team, I think they're a little right of center.
Yeah, no. I do have the impression that quote unquote Uncle Larry might be quietly not so. And look, that's what that self-selection process, I think you can't discount, right? I think the problem there is I'd be suspicious of a lot of the managers and people lower on down the train. But I mean, my point is just, there are already deep anchors here of sectors of business and the kind of elements you need to think internationally that are just, just more of that than there is in Florida, right? So kind of bigger planets is the way I'd describe it.
So I think this is my last question, unless you can think of something else, but and feel free not to talk about this if you don't know much about it. I definitely don't know much about it, but it's interesting to me. So you were there, I remember, in the winter. You had just gotten there when there's this really historic cold snap and the grid was on, I don't remember the details, but basically the Texas electrical grid was in trouble and on the verge of failure. Didn't fail at the end of the day, as I recall. But there was a whole lot of traffic at that time of leftists saying, this is proof that your supposed superior red state governance model doesn't work. You almost turned the lights out on yourself. This is proof that Texas is, incompetent and, can't live without we blue geniuses who I don't know exactly what they do to provide Texas with electricity. But anyway, there was much taunting and braying over that. And I'm sure a lot of people, I'm sure, have forgotten all about it. But I'd love to hear your take on what you think happened and what the meaning, if any, was.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two kind of low IQ takes, and one is what you just said. I mean, one is these Republicans and this is a failure, and it's you actually have a terrible system, and that's not true for reasons I'll go into in a minute. And then the other take was from the right was, this is all the fault of lefties pushing alternative power on us, right? It was all the fault of windmills and whatever, which failed miserably. And there's some truth to that, but that's not the whole truth either, from just what I can make out and talking to a lot of people who knew what happened. Because I was stuck here during it. It was hilarious to me. We grew up in cold weather places, but I'm there with 4 kids in an Airbnb before we moved into our house. And, there was no power in that house and it's 0 degrees out for days. I ended up going to a friend's house across town, which is treacherous because, no one has snow tires. There's no plows, right? So the first thing to realize about this event was this really was like a once in a century kind of confluence of weather that just doesn't usually happen. I mean, the fact that you had, snow and cold in places across the state, like Austin. I mean, this is just bizarre, right? So first off, you have something that's just exceedingly rare in terms of duration, temperatures involved, and then precipitation that just doesn't usually happen. So what does happen then is, if you don't, in other words, to counter a once in 100-year storm, you have to overbuild everything thinking about the once in 100-year storm, right? No matter what kind of storm you're talking about. And so I think what I could see happened is that especially natural gas facilities did not build in the ability to defend against freezing weather for an extended period of time with snow. The idea that this is somehow related to the failure of the system, well, there probably are some systemic issues that we could talk about coming out of this, and certainly I see various experts I respect going into it, but this was a freak storm. That
I wonder if some of the left wing, taunting wasn't due a little bit from Schadenfreude from Californians. That is to say, I mean, California has been suffering via policy failure, primarily rolling blackouts since the early 2000s, so for 20 years.
Exactly.
And they have the nerve to taunt Texas for this happening once, as if this proves the red state failure and red state model failure and Republican incompetence.
And think about this, right? I mean, they've been attacking this grid for a long time. I mean, they have weakened it with the alternative energy. I mean, it's true about the windmills, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of truth to the conservative case for the energy case. So they've been weakening it on purpose for a long time. And what's really disgusting to me about this is that they hate. It's very clear they hate the idea that Texas has its own grid. I
noticed that.
I noticed that. They said there for a long time.
Yeah.
They can't stand this idea that Texas has its own grid, which makes me want to say, look, let's learn from what just happened. Let's make this grid bigger, badder, and better than it ever was before.
That was very clear in a lot of the commentary that I saw was, this proves that you have to lock yourself into the national grid now, which basically says become dependent on us, was how I read that.
Oh yeah. And you could see,
or give it, put yourself at our mercy, right? Yes. And I can see why Texas would say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, and the argument here within the state was it reminded me of kind of the globalist argument everywhere, right? Yeah. To be enlightened and to show how enlightened we are, of course, as elites here in Texas, we must become, reasonable about these things and give over, basically power and self-governance to these, this other network, which is absolutely insane, antithetical to the spirit of the state, and would make America weaker. I mean, one of the strongest things about that grid is that in a case of national emergency, right, because you're decentralizing these things, it makes America stronger in terms of national security. And this is really the big way that big states should be thinking, right? I mean, even Lord Gavin in California, let's talk about him for a minute. I mean, he's not wrong that if you're in charge of an economy that's that enormous, a state with that much power, you should be thinking big. And in fact, that's healthy in normal times for the American regime. And so I think it's really important that we start to broaden the horizons of even what's possible in states like this. And this is why I love Texas, because I think people here are much more comfortable and welcoming to an argument that says we need to think, bigger than any state ever has in terms of, mega projects that are going to bring back supply chains. We need to think internationally about how we counter this kind of destructive globalism with, just bolder policies than anyone's even thought of. Yeah. And that are thinking again internationally, and that would be good for America.
Yeah, it's hard. I mentioned this in the review, though. To me, Miller, the book goes through lots of different policy areas. But I focus most on energy because it seems to me to be the most important one. Both for the Texas economy, it really illustrates the difference between Texas and California, but it also illustrates this very fraught relationship between, let's say, Texas and the feds. I mean, you said earlier, like Biden's telling workers in the energy sector, I'm taking your jobs away. I'm going to shut down these projects, right? I think that could get into a very heated argument before long between Texas and the feds. And this isn't strictly speaking a Texas versus California view, but it kind of is, because a lot of the driving passion and power comes from California public opinion filtered through its elected officials who go to Washington and say, everything has to be wind and solar, and we got to go carbon neutral, and we got to stop drilling, and we got to get rid of gasoline cars and all this. And I mean, if I know anything about Texas, it's energy is big, and they're not down with that program. And if there's an attempt to sort of force it on them, basically shut down not only your most important economic sector, but the one that basically built the state over the last 100 years. I just don't see them accepting that meekly. And so, again, just to bring it back to my own personal grievances, for mentioning that, I get accused of trying to foment a civil war.
Yeah, I just think I think that the amount of just denial and the idiocy of those charges against you. I think a part of the problem is that people are in denial about this actual divide in the country, and they just don't want to think about that in a really a manly way. Like, they don't want to directly look at the actual problems, what people are actually thinking. That scares them, and so they suck their thumbs and say, "Oh, you're talking about civil war, and it's very bad." And in the meantime, look, we're talking about right now companies like ExxonMobil, right, getting basically sideswiped and then threatened by global capital, like financial institutions, and forced, really, and pushed into woke policies that are going to be, destructive to Americans, and especially to states, Texans, people who live in Texas. So this is like the crux of it. Are these red states going to stand up? Because they're the last institutions left that can. Yeah. And are they going to stand up or not to woke capital? And I think what we're going to see, and you and I both know this, we are going to see this debate play out because of the way in which even the governors are staking out their position. The legislatures are passing bills staking out their position. So we are on a collision course in terms of federalism between, red states and Texas and Florida, especially, versus the feds. The question is going to be, what actually happens with that? Is this just a show or not? And is there going to be a sticking point where, one of these states stands up and continues to stand, and a number of them, come to each other's aid and stand? Now, I think with the mask mandates, right, you sort of see something like that now. You saw a bunch of states just say this week, as we're recording this, they said, we're not going to follow any of this crap. The CDC is insane. But there's going to be more and more examples like that. And if red states don't stand up, I kind of see them as the last bulwark, if you will, the last bastion, the last hope. And I don't think it's all doom and gloom, but if they don't stand up, it's kind of over.
Well, I hate to end there, but I don't have any more questions. I think we covered all the topics I wanted to cover. Is there something that I didn't ask about either state that occurs to you? Again, we have our special guest is someone with very recent and direct experience with both states, so he's got some expertise here that I lack, having only lived in one of the two.
I would just say, just reiterate one thing that's come up a few times in this conversation, and that is the possibility. It's a hopeful thing that I'm about to say. The possibility that exists in red states, the possibility that exists in Texas, to think big and to take actions to help save the country, to rethink policy, to rethink our political approach. I think that is very real, and it's
really in a way to really operationalize Louis Brandeis's famous laboratory of the states. We don't all. The reason why there's 50 of us, we don't all have to do exactly, and we have our own legislature. Each state has its own legislature, can pass its own laws, elect its own people. It's precisely so that they're not all required to do exactly the same thing the same way. They're in different parts of the country. They have different natural resources. They have different economies. They have different populations. They should be able to do things to some degree differently.
Yeah, and I just think that's a real possibility, and I think that people need to realize that there's money, there's resources, there's talent that's coalescing in these places, and I think exciting things are going to come out of that. And I think we should be explicit that this is happening.
I do have one other question, which is, are you yet seeing any kind of, red political or intellectual cross-pollination between Florida and Texas? Like, is there a sense amongst kind of more base types in both states that our two states are the leaders and we should be talking to one another?
Well, look, DeSantis says this himself. I saw him give a talk here, and I mean, the way he put it was sort of as a friendly competition. Like, I'm going to come up with great policies, and I'm going to keep you on your toes. But also, he certainly speaks about it in a way that's hey, we need to work together. I think there has been some of that, probably not enough in my view. I think what is going to create that situation is a common enemy, right? Yeah. And you do start to see that emerging, especially with the virus restriction stuff. And as this kind of thing, as there's a common enemy, right, you're going to see these states really, the cross-pollination will increase. So I think that the bridges have been established to some degree already across Texas, between Texas and Florida, and in other red states. But I think there's going to be a lot more traffic on those bridges in the coming years, just because of necessity.
All right.
Well, let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
I just want to plug your own book. People should realize worth the price of admission for the stakes. It's worth buying the stakes just for the beginning chapter going into California, using California as the example. It's one of the best descriptions that's in print of why someone would leave California. And I encourage people who are listening to this, if you haven't gone out and bought Mike's book, you should.
Oh, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I don't think I'm capable of rattling them off the top of my head, but the first chapter has, it's an account of what California used to be and what it is now. And then there are a whole bunch of subheadings in which I describe the character of California today. Like, what is it really like today? And I said, these are the 15, if I recall, subheadings to describe California circa 2020. Crowded, costly, congested, crumbling, incompetent, filthy, dangerous, rapacious, profligate, suffocating, prejudiced, theocratic, pathologically altruistic, balkanized, and feudal. And each one of those subheadings gives, a couple pages of description and well-chosen examples to illustrate the point. So, yeah, I mean, not a pretty picture, but then again, I didn't paint it.
The corruption alone.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, Matt. You were obviously the ideal, maybe other than the author himself, you're the ideal guest to talk about that particular topic. And now that we're done, I'm turning it back over to Ryan Williams.
Thank you for listening to The Stakes. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our new Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Good ratings helps us spread the message and the good news of the American Mind and the Claremont Institute and all of our work. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next time.